What if every uprising, every riot, every act of resistance happened exactly the way the founders wanted? Because the most terrifying possibility isn't that the founders couldn't stop rebellions. It's that they built the entire system around them. And if that's true, then the greatest weapon inside the silo isn't judicial.
It isn't IT.
It isn't the cameras. It's hope. The hope that people can change the system. Because every time someone believes they can overthrow the people in power, they unknowingly become another piece of the founders' design. But here's what changes everything. Throughout Silo, every rebellion ends the same way. Different people, different leaders, different reasons. Yet somehow, the outcome never really changes.
The system survives.
The silo survives. The cycle survives. That's not coincidence. That's architecture. And once you notice it, almost every major event in the series begins to look completely different. Look at what the show is actually telling us. The founders didn't just leave behind rules. They left behind behavior. Not instructions for machines. Instructions for people. Think about that for a second. Most governments prepare for disasters. The founders prepared for human nature.
Fear. Curiosity.
Anger.
Hope. Love.
Every emotion that could eventually threaten the silo wasn't ignored. It was calculated. And this is where it gets darker. Most viewers assume the pact exists to prevent chaos. But what if the pact exists for the opposite reason? What if it was designed to create just enough pressure that rebellion becomes inevitable? Because pressure always creates release. That's psychology. The more tightly people are controlled, the more desperately they want freedom. The founders would have known this. They weren't trying to eliminate rebellion. They were predicting it, maybe even scheduling it. This is the detail everyone missed. The silo has survived for generations. Hundreds of years. That means countless people have lived, countless people have questioned, and countless people have fought against the system. Yet the civilization inside the silo still functions almost exactly as intended. Ask yourself one question. How is that statistically possible? How can a society survive for centuries without eventually collapsing under repeated revolts? Unless those revolts were already part of the design. Notice something strange. Whenever information starts spreading, someone always reacts in a way that pushes events toward conflict. Secrets create curiosity. Curiosity creates investigations. Investigations expose lies. Lies create outrage. Outrage creates rebellion. It's almost mechanical, almost predictable, like dominoes arranged long before the first one falls. That's not the real mystery. The real mystery is why the dominoes were placed there in the first place. Look closely at Bernard. Most people see him as the man protecting power. But his behavior is more complicated than that. He rarely looks surprised, even when impossible situations unfold. Even when Juliet uncovers truths she was never supposed to find. Even when plans begin collapsing around him. He doesn't behave like someone facing unexpected disaster. He behaves like someone managing expected damage. That's a completely different mindset. Imagine you're guarding the last surviving human civilization. Would your biggest fear really be one mechanic asking questions? Probably not. Unless you've seen this happen before. Unless history keeps repeating itself. Unless every generation produces someone exactly like Juliet. Someone curious. Someone brave. Someone impossible to control. And instead of preventing people like her, the system quietly prepares for them. That sounds unbelievable. Until you remember one important fact. The founders planned centuries ahead. Not years. Centuries. People who think on that scale don't solve today's problems. They solve tomorrow's problems before tomorrow even exists. So maybe they asked a terrifying question. What happens when people stop believing? Their answer wasn't to stop rebellion. It was to absorb it.
Think about forests.
Small controlled fires prevent catastrophic wildfires. Without those smaller burns, pressure builds. Eventually, everything explodes. Now apply that idea to society. Could rebellion be the controlled fire? Could every uprising actually release dangerous pressure before the entire civilization collapses? If so, the rebels aren't destroying the system. They're maintaining it. And suddenly, history begins making frightening sense. Every rebellion creates fear. Every failure reinforces obedience. Every generation inherits the lesson. Don't question too much. Don't search too far. Don't become the next rebel. The system doesn't merely survive rebellion. It feeds on its memory. But here's another clue hiding in plain sight. Whenever forbidden knowledge appears, the response isn't immediate extermination. It's observation.
People are watched.
Measured. Allowed to move. Allowed to discover. Allowed to make choices.
Why?
Because genuine rebellion can't be forced. It has to grow naturally. Otherwise, it teaches nothing. This feels less like law enforcement and more like an experiment. An experiment repeated across generations. The founders weren't just preserving humanity. They were studying humanity. And every rebellion became another test. Who leads? Who follows? Who sacrifices? Who betrays? Who chooses truth over safety? Every answer becomes data. Every generation writes another chapter in the same experiment. But then we arrive at Juliet. And this is where everything starts to break. Because unlike previous rebels, she doesn't simply challenge authority. She challenges the assumptions the founders expected every rebel to make. She's asking different questions, looking in different places, connecting truths that were never meant to meet. And if our theory is correct, then Juliet isn't dangerous because she's rebelling. She's dangerous because she's refusing to play the role every previous rebel played. That may be the first event the founders never predicted. Or it may be exactly what they were waiting for all along. Because the deeper we dig into the history of the silo, the more impossible one question becomes to ignore. What if the founders didn't create rebellions to protect the silo from collapse, but to prepare humanity for something waiting outside? That final question changes everything. Because if the founders truly needed rebellions, then we have been looking at the wrong enemy this entire time. Everyone assumes the conflict in Silo is between the people and the people in power. But that's too simple. Look at what the show is actually telling us. The real conflict isn't control versus freedom. It's survival versus human nature. Those are two very different battles. Human beings don't like permanent control. History proves it. Every civilization eventually produces people who question authority. Some become leaders. Some become revolutionaries. Some become symbols. The founders understood that better than anyone. So instead of trying to erase that instinct, they engineered a system that could survive it. That's why every layer of the silo feels strangely prepared for crisis. The security systems, the emergency procedures, the hidden tunnels, the secret records, the strict separation between departments. None of these exist only to maintain order. They exist because someone expected order to fail. And this is where it gets darker. Think about mechanical. For years, the people at the bottom have carried the greatest burden. They keep the generators alive. They work in impossible conditions. They are isolated from the upper levels. Yet they also develop the strongest sense of independence.
Why?
At first, it looks like class inequality. But what if it's something much more deliberate? Mechanical produces people like Juliet. People who solve problems instead of accepting explanations. People who trust evidence more than authority. That personality isn't an accident. It's created by the environment. The founders may have known that every generation would need someone capable of thinking differently. Not to destroy the silo, but to test whether humanity was still capable of independent thought. This is the detail everyone missed. The silo constantly creates the very people it claims to fear. That sounds irrational, unless those people serve a purpose. Notice how forbidden relics are treated. They're hidden. They're illegal. People are punished for owning them. But somehow they never completely disappear. Generation after generation, relics continue to exist. Maps.
Books.
Old objects. Fragments of the past. How is that possible? If the system truly wanted them gone, they would have disappeared centuries ago. Instead, they continue resurfacing, almost as if someone allows enough forbidden knowledge to survive. Not enough to destroy society, just enough to keep curiosity alive. That's an important distinction, because curiosity is dangerous. But curiosity is also necessary. Without curiosity, humanity stops evolving. So the founders faced an impossible choice: protect civilization or preserve human potential. Maybe they chose both. They protected civilization by controlling information, but they preserve humanity by allowing small cracks to appear in the system. Cracks that eventually become questions. Questions that eventually become investigations. Investigations that eventually become rebellions. The rebellion isn't the mistake. It's the final stage of the test. Now think about Bernard again. Many viewers believe he hides information because he's power-hungry. But watch his decisions carefully. Again and again, he sacrifices popularity to preserve stability.
He lies.
He manipulates. He isolates himself. These are not the actions of someone chasing admiration. They're the actions of someone carrying a burden nobody else understands. Does that make him a hero?
No.
But it raises another terrifying possibility. What if Bernard isn't protecting himself? What if he's protecting a timeline? Imagine inheriting centuries of instructions written by the founders. Instructions explaining exactly what happens when rebellion reaches certain stages. Imagine knowing that every decision you make has already been anticipated. Would you still feel like a leader? Or would you realize you're just another caretaker following a script? That's not the real mystery. The real mystery is whether Bernard has any freedom at all. Maybe he believes he's making choices. Maybe every choice has already been accounted for. And suddenly the people in power start looking just as trapped as everyone else. That's an incredible reversal. The rulers aren't controlling the system. The system is controlling the rulers. Look at what the show is actually telling us. Every generation inherits rules they didn't write. Every leader inherits secrets they didn't create. Every rebellion follows patterns established long before anyone involved was born. No one is actually free. Not the citizens. Not judicial. Not IT. Not even Bernard. Everyone is living inside a machine built centuries earlier. A machine designed not only to preserve life, but to preserve predictable human behavior. And this is where it gets even darker. Suppose the founders knew exactly how many rebellions a society could survive. Suppose they measured the breaking point of hope itself. Too much freedom leads to chaos. Too much oppression leads to revolution. The only stable society is one balanced between the two. That balance is horrifying, because it means suffering isn't an unintended consequence. It's a controlled variable. Every execution, every arrest, every secret, every missing file, every restricted level, every forbidden conversation. They're not random acts of tyranny. They're adjustments. Tiny corrections keeping the social experiment alive. Think about cleaning. One of the most iconic rituals in Silo. Everyone believes it's punishment. But look deeper. Cleaning isn't just about removing people. It's about reinforcing belief. The people inside watch. They witness the same outcome. Again, and again, and again. Every cleaning becomes a psychological lesson. Don't challenge the system. Don't trust your own eyes. Don't believe there's another way. Fear spreads far more efficiently than force ever could. That's exactly how long-term conditioning works. The founders didn't need soldiers on every floor. They needed stories. Stories repeated for generations become truth. Truth becomes culture. Culture becomes obedience. And once obedience becomes tradition, the system barely has to enforce itself anymore. That's the brilliance of the founders' design. They didn't build a prison with stronger walls. They built a prison people would maintain themselves. But here's what changes everything. Juliet doesn't respond to stories. She responds to evidence. She questions what she sees. She tests assumptions. She refuses inherited beliefs. That makes her fundamentally different from previous rebels. She's not fighting because she's angry. She's fighting because the evidence no longer matches the official story. And that's the one type of rebellion the founders may never have been able to contain. Because once facts begin replacing fear, even the most carefully designed system starts to crack. And if that crack keeps growing, then the next rebellion won't simply repeat history. It will expose why the founders needed rebellions in the first place. Because perhaps the greatest secret wasn't hidden in the vault, or inside IT, or even inside Bernard's knowledge. Perhaps it was hidden inside the rebellion itself. Perhaps the greatest secret in Silo was never hidden inside a vault.
It was hidden inside the pattern.
Because once you stop looking at each rebellion as an isolated event, something impossible begins to appear. Every rebellion follows almost the same path. Someone discovers forbidden knowledge. They begin asking questions. Others slowly join them. Authority pushes back. Chaos spreads. The truth comes closer than ever before, and then everything resets. At first, this looks like history repeating itself. But here's what changes everything. History isn't repeating itself. It's being managed. Think about the way engineers test a bridge. They don't simply build it and hope it survives. They apply pressure. Again. And again. Each test reveals the bridge's weak points before a real disaster can destroy it. Now imagine a silo as that bridge. What if every rebellion is nothing more than a stress test? Not to destroy the system, but to prove it can survive another generation. Suddenly, every uprising has a completely different meaning. The founders weren't asking, can people obey forever? They were asking, can our system survive when they stop obeying? That is a far more intelligent and far more terrifying question. Look at what the show is actually telling us. The founders never expected perfect citizens. They expected imperfect humans. People who would lie. People who would love. People who would grieve. People who would become curious. People who would eventually rebel. In other words, they designed the silo around the one thing they knew they could never eliminate: human nature. And this is where it gets darker. Every generation believes they are the first to discover the truth. Juliet believes she's uncovering hidden secrets. Before her, others believed the same. Before them, someone else almost certainly believed the same. Each generation thinks they are unique. But from the founders' perspective, they may simply be another predictable cycle. That realization is terrifying, because it means the founders may have understood humanity better than humanity understands itself. Think about Bernard one last time. Throughout the series, he constantly speaks about preserving order. Most viewers interpret that as political language. But what if order means something much larger? Not keeping his position, not protecting IT, not protecting judicial, protecting the experiment itself. Because if the experiment ends too early, everything the founders sacrificed could disappear forever. That doesn't justify his actions, but it explains why he makes impossible choices without hesitation. He isn't protecting today's people. He's protecting tomorrow's survival. Whether he's right or horribly wrong is another question entirely. This is the detail everyone missed. The founders rarely appear in the story, yet their influence is everywhere. Every rule, every department, every hidden passage, every surveillance system, every restriction, even every rebellion. It's almost as though they're still governing the silo centuries after their deaths. That is real power. Power that doesn't depend on soldiers. Power that doesn't depend on fear alone. Power that survives because people unknowingly continue following the script. But then Juliet arrives and something changes. Notice what makes her different. She doesn't simply reject authority. She questions the assumptions underneath authority. Most rebels ask, who is lying to us? Juliet asks, why was this lie created in the first place? That's a much more dangerous question. Because once you understand the purpose behind a lie, the lie loses its power. The founders may have anticipated rebellion. They may have anticipated heroes. They may have anticipated revolutions. But did they anticipate someone investigating the design of the cycle itself? That is much harder to predict. Imagine realizing that every choice you've ever made was expected. Every emotional reaction. Every protest. Every attempt to expose the truth. Every victory. Every defeat. If that happened, what would real freedom even look like? That's the true horror of Silo. Not that people live underground. Not that they're constantly watched. Not even that they're lied to. The true horror is the possibility that their rebellion has always been part of the prison. Because a prison doesn't need stronger walls if it can predict exactly how its prisoners will behave. And maybe that was the founders' greatest invention. Not the silo itself, but a system that could survive the collapse of trust, the rise of resistance, and the passing of centuries without ever losing control. Yet there is one problem. Every model eventually encounters an exception. Every equation eventually meets a variable it cannot solve. Every experiment eventually produces an unexpected result. Juliet may be that result. Not because she's the strongest. Not because she's the smartest. But because she's beginning to ask questions the system was never designed to answer. And if she's already broken one cycle, how many others are about to fall? Which leads to one final possibility. What if the founders didn't create rebellions to stop humanity from destroying the silo? What if they created rebellions to identify the one person, generations later, who could finally be trusted with the truth? If that's true, then everything we've seen so far has only been the selection process. The real test may only be beginning. And if Season 3 is quietly revealing that possibility, then the biggest twist isn't that the founders planned every rebellion. It's that they may have been waiting for one rebellion to finally succeed.